We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on, guys.
Yeah.
When we were going through the list of, property experts to invite to our podcast, we are like, who do we need? We need a property manager. Who do we get along with? Alex,
But
duh.
also, like, who do we respect? Who
Oh
do
yeah,
we
that
think?
too.
More importantly,
Check, check, check. Yeah.
but who are our listeners, listeners, and audience going to want to hear from? And you just have such a profound knowledge and understanding of your industry and your market that, yeah, there's no one else we would
Yeah,
sitting here on the
yeah,
couch with us.
yeah. And you're
So, yeah.
easy to talk to.
Yeah.
And yeah, anything property related, I
Yeah.
always call you and you are always there to answer because I could not think of anything worse than having to do something property management related.
You've got to have a certain way about approaching it because it's a combination of like solving problems, but then also dealing with people. And as we know, problems and people, they don't always mix so well.
And so let's get into it
Yeah.
with our very first question. And what we would like you to have speak to us about is how you got into your career as a property manager and how long have you been doing it?
10 years in the game. I've been a director of a business for the last 2 years.
Yes, congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, it was always in the cards to be a business owner, and I'm very, very pleased that I made that jump. When I was starting out, I was working for an English language college in Chippendale in the city, and at the time I was managing their dormitories. So effectively a property manager, right? But while I was doing that, I remember looking into it and being like, I don't know if I'm actually qualified. Like, am I qualified to be doing this? You know, I'm a 22-year-old. I've sort of been doing this for, 6 months or whatever. But if someone came a knocking, fair trading or what have you, would I be okay, and say, hey, yes, I'm allowed to do this? And so I went and got my certificate of registration and put that up on LinkedIn. And then the lovely Sharon Benny gave me a call, good old Shazza. And she called me and she said, hey, I might have a job for you. And yeah, the rest is history.
What does a property manager effectively do? What is your role?
Very simply, we maximize the rent that your property is going to get. We minimize the damage and mitigate that sort of the issues across the length of the tenancy. And we manage your compliance risk, your legal and compliance risk. Okay. So let's talk about the first one there, maximizing your rent. Not too long ago, I set a building and suburb record over in Westmead because it was a new building going up. And what happens when you have a new building going up and everyone's settling at the same time? They all come on the market at the same time, which meant that suddenly when a tenant was looking online, it went from 20 properties to 200. And that devalued everybody else, right? Because the volume of supply meant that the price came down. And so I looked at it and I said, okay, who do we want? Who do we want in this area? What is the main feature of this particular suburb, Westmead? The hospital. So I made a couple calls and I set the open house at 3:20 in the afternoon because it was shift change.
Smart.
So the shift change meant that I had a doctor who came through, single female, and the client who was originally going to pop her daughter into the property after 6 months, the daughter can sort herself out. She's re-signed another 6 months because the tenant is awesome. She's so good and she's secure. She's not going anywhere for her residency. She's going to be in that location. So that's the first thing. Then there's minimizing the damage, and that's a lot about education. It's a lot about working with the tenants to show them what they should and shouldn't be doing. Common sense is not that common. I think we all know this. And so there's certain things that we expect of people that actually they don't know. One of the ones that is pretty classic is that if you've got carpet, in the special conditions, we say you're not allowed to put pot plants on the carpet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I have been a rookie with that.
Yeah, it's something because we think about the touch and feel of the place. You know what I mean? You've got a beautiful whatever, palm tree, nasturtium, who cares, right? Something nice, a fiddly thing, something like that. And you put it in your pot and it looks gorgeous, and then you forget that it's overflowed and you've got all this disgusting water that's, exactly, and it stains.
You did that?
But that's something that we educate people on. Do you know what I mean? And we're teaching them how to look after the property for the long term. And then we're also advising on like what is more important, less important, what will last you longer. So I've got a really good example of a property like that where I had a client, nothing was done to the property for like 20 years. No repairs and maintenance, Nothing. And so now the cost to bring it up to market, not even to make it nice, just to bring it up to market is so prohibitive because all of those little things haven't been done. So that's a really important thing, looking at the investment, that it does actually take capital investment over time in order to bring it up to market value. Then the last thing is your compliance risk. So that's things like your smoke alarms compliance, water efficiency certificates, and that sort of things. In other states, of course, it's different. They've got things like their electricity checks that they've got to do. New South Wales, we don't have as many things that are in place, but making sure that that's up to date. A good example is that if you don't have a smoke alarm certificate for your property and you have a lease on it, tear it up. It's not worth it. Literally, if you go to tribunal and you didn't have a smoke alarm certificate for the property, throw it out. Like it's not worth anything. The other thing is doing inspections, right? So going there, checking it out. You know, one of my little sort of tells is that if I walk into a tenant's started burning incense, I have a suspicion they've probably been smoking in the property and they're trying to cover it up.
Or they're hiding a pet.
Talking about animals, because pet ownership has increased, right? Like over COVID, it became the thing that people started to, COVID companions, that, you know. And my opinion is that some properties are okay with pets, some properties aren't, and it really does depend on the pet.
How many times do you find people want pets?
Very common. I would say we probably went from maybe 15 to 20% up to 45%.
Are you still getting landlord resistance? Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my next thing. Or how do you manage landlord resistance to pets?
There's two problems involved in that. Problem number one is that they're anticipated damage, but also they are not anticipating or not trusting that the agent is actually going to solve the problem at the end of the tenancy. So we always have in our leases, for example, if you've got a pet, there's a pet agreement at the end, which is where you fumigate afterwards and you've got to do a professional clean, because obviously anyone moving in after that, if they're allergic, then they can't live in the property, and that's not fair, right? So fumigation, pest control, that's all part and parcel. And any damage caused by the pet is the responsibility of the pet owner. That is basic. Do you know what I mean? And that's literally written into the standard REI New South Wales lease, right? But it's something that a lot of people don't consider. It's not what they think about, or they think that, oh, you know, because it's a cute dog or whatever, a cute cat, you know, they're not going to have to worry about it. But, you know, I know what pet damage looks like, and it's never the pet. It's always the owner.
So then what happens when you go to an inspection and you realize that there is a pet, but they weren't approved for a pet?
They did a sneaky. It happens more often than you'd like to think. What we often have to do is we'll talk to the owner about it. We'll say, what's your opinion about this? Because when they were approved, obviously it wasn't part of the conversation. If they do have an issue with it, we might go down the path of doing breach notices. 3 breach notices and you can send a termination. So depending on the situation, it gets a little bit complicated when you actually look at, you know, what you breach for and so on and so forth, but a rule of thumb. It might end up having to go to tribunal, for example, if you do have to terminate for that, for breaches. Generally speaking, I wouldn't say tribunal looks favorably on, you'd have to really have really good reason why you don't want a pet in that property. You know what I mean? But most of the time we end up solving that problem by just having them sign a pet agreement.
So following on from that, what is your tenant screening process? What does that look like?
So broadly speaking, there's 4 things that we look at. 100 points of ID. So the way I like to say, sometimes we get people being like, oh, you know, why do I need to do all of this? I'm like, well, you've seen the property. I opened the doors for you. This part of the contractual agreement, you've seen what I've got to bring. Now you've got to show me what you've got to bring, right? So 100 points of ID, you've got to be who you say you are. Do you know what I mean? And I have a little bit of I've been doing this now for so long, if I've met someone in person and I've got a little bit of a weird feeling, I'll Google them, I'll find out. Like the amount of times that I found out that people have, you know, double lives, or that they were recently kicked out of Westpac for doing millions of dollars worth of fraud or something like that. Yeah, it's happened fairly frequently. So yeah, you get a sense for them at the inspection. So the ID is really important. Then you've got your proof of employment, or if you're self-employed, then, you know, tax statements or something that shows that. Employment is a really important part of it. And right now, because of how competitive things are in the current market, I'd almost say that a lot of applications are now asking for more than even like a mortgage would be asking for. Like you have to show some like significant stuff. So the really important thing about the proof of employment is that I never want to see that the rent is more than 1/3 of your income. Okay, more than that, and that's considered to be rent stress.
Yeah.
So it's not ethical to sign up a tenant who is going to be immediately in rent stress from that very beginning point. Yeah, yeah. So 1/3 is kind of the sweet spot, and that's the gross amount, right? So if you've got multiple people moving into a property, sharers, a couple, or what have you, then you'd hope to see that that gross amount is more than 1/3 of the rent. I don't really care who pays what and how much and so on and so forth. If it's a share house, you know, one person's got a balcony and one person's got an ensuite. That's not my business, right? But that's what we want to see, okay, is making sure that they're going to be healthy, because ultimately a tenant who can pay the rent is a good tenant. Do you know what I mean? And that's what we're trying to find, that sweet spot. And if you put them in stress, they're more likely to misbehave later. Then we've got proof of funds. So we want to see a snapshot of the bank statement. I don't need to see your transaction history, although I have received transaction histories before and read through them, which I don't normally do. Like, I have a look, do you know what I mean? I scan, but I don't really go into it. A couple of years ago, there was a gentleman, he'd come from overseas and he had like $100,000 in his bank account. And I was like, good on you, mate. Like, well done. But I got the 14 pages of his bank statement. And from page 2 onwards, it was like $5,000. So he'd had like $95,000 suddenly appear in the bank account. And on the description, it said for rent show. It was coming from some person. And so I called him. I said, oh, mate, listen, I just want to know, like, why does it say for rent show on your thing? And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't want to say this. And it's just because it's so hard, blah, blah, blah. My friend, he transferred me this money so that I could show you and so on and so on. And I said, now that you've told me that, thank you for your honesty. But now that you've told me that, I now have to go through your application with a fine-tooth comb because you've broken my trust. Do you know what I mean? He didn't end up getting it.
The screening process is intense.
Yeah.
Well, so that's only point 3. So then point 4 is your tenancy history, right? So there's a couple of misnomers about that. We do, in Sydney, we get a lot of people coming from overseas. We get a lot of people moving out of their homes and they're renting for the first time. Maybe they're downsizers and they're in between properties, or they've been sharing and they don't really have a ledger. So that's probably the most frequently waived part of an application. But having a really good rental history is a very, very powerful thing. Very powerful. And some people do get worried about small little blips and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, a very experienced agent can look at a ledger and identify, okay, this is what happened at this point. And if they give you a call and say, hey, what's going on? Fair enough. Do you know what I mean? I actually had a tenant not too long ago who, it was by no fault of his own, for whatever reason, someone was putting in the paid to dates on the other end on like wrong. Right, so his ledger looked like he was in arrears the whole time, right, the whole time. So I called him, I'm like, mate, like this looks awful, like what's going on? And he was like, I pay my rent on time. And he started showing me the receipts, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. Based on because he sent me his ledger, sorry, his lease, and it says paying on Friday, and looked at all the dates, and that's correct. I called the agent, and they said, oh yeah, someone made a mistake at some point, but we just went with it. That poor guy, do you know what I mean? But again, I'm experienced, so I can see this and I can identify that there's been a stuff up somewhere.
And I think some property managers would only just look at the ledger and go, nah, put it aside, next application. But you have actually gone the extra mile and go, what happened? This is a question mark.
Well, I mean, in this case, nothing matched up, right? Like his phenomenal rental employment reference, great money in the bank, lovely at the inspection, and then you've got this problem. Do you know what I mean? It's an outlier, so I had to investigate there. Do you know what I mean? If everything had sort of been a bit of then I would have been, nah, don't worry about it.
Have there been any, I guess, regulatory changes recently that impact tenants and landlords?
Absolutely. Oh my God. So my favorite one of recent was during the last couple of years. And we had, during COVID, they stopped, in an attempt to stop rent bidding. So that's where you create a rent auction and the solicitation. We were not allowed to solicit bids from other tenants, right? The problem was we didn't have to. So people were already putting more into their applications, $10, $20, $15 more anyway, right? But because of the change to that legislation, I was not allowed to call another applicant and tell them that that person had put $15 more in, because that was solicitation. So really good tenants were missing out on opportunities because of the law that had been put in place. And so I'd call them afterwards and I'd say, listen, this is the situation. I'm so sorry you've not been approved. But someone else was, $10, $15 more. And they get angry and they say, why didn't you tell me? And I had to say, oh, I'm so sorry, but it's because the government says I'm not allowed to tell you that solicitation. Do you know what I mean? They then did a complete 180 reverse. Now, if we get a higher bid, we've got to immediately update everyone. So everyone gets in writing within 24 hours, the updated amount. And ideally, that updated amount should also go on the app, the actual advertisement as well.
So what would be the craziest story that you can share legally?
I've had tenants be arrested before in the middle of the night. I've had not my unit, but another unit in a building, a drug lab in the garage exploded.
Oh my
Oh yeah. So they had a garage, they had lock-up garages. They had a drug lab in the garage. It literally exploded. And the way that the building had been built, all of the services were above the garages. Gas, sewage, electricity, water, everything. The whole building was condemned, the whole thing, while they were identifying what they could and couldn't do. So hundreds of people then had to immediately evacuate that building. And the really interesting thing about that one was that Strata, their insurance didn't cover tenancies.
What?
The investor owners were like, what do you mean your insurance doesn't cover tenancies?
Why?
Wait, so it's a legal requirement for landlords to have landlord insurance,
Landlord's
right?
insurance,
Yeah.
yes. But when it comes down to a strata issue, then it's strata who has to be because it's a whole building thing. So it was a structural issue there. Landlord's insurance is an absolute must. Like we saw during COVID, the haves and the have-nots, right? The people who had it and who didn't, and who were absolutely screwed over, and who actually had their rent paid while someone was on a reduction or if they were on a deferral.
So then what happened with that building?
I frustrated the agreement. So what that means is that basically I just said that the property was uninhabitable, which it kind of was, but like someone probably could have.
Yeah.
And the tenant was very happy about that because then he didn't have to continue paying rent. But that was a bit of an unconventional solution to that problem, which a lot of the other agents were not looking into.
See, there you go.
Yeah.
Finding the right
Yeah.
property manager that will find a solution.
Yeah.
Joining the dots like that's really important, and having an overview of what you've got. I've got a really good story not too long ago where I had a tenant was moving. So we had a new client and she really wanted a certain price on her property. And I had another client and he wanted his tenants out early because he wanted to renovate. Right. And so the new client was like, listen, they've got another agent. We came in as like a secondary agent because it was vacant at the time. So we were able to, help out. And so we literally moved the tenants from that property to the other one. And so she got the price she wanted. They loved it as well. They were like, this is because it ended up being cheaper and larger than where they currently were. And then the owner who renovated, he was then able to get an extra $500 a week more for that unit. So all because we just said, yeah, no worries. Don't worry about break fees or what have you. Like just move from here to there.
Navigating the puzzle, right? Just like finding a solution to everyone.
And I think in property as well, and certainly from an investor's point of view, attack the problem, not the people. Do you know what I mean? There is a problem. Don't get angry that this person's done this or what have you. Leave that aside. Just focus on the problem and then the solution can be found there.
What are the common things that people misunderstand most about you as a property manager?
Okay, so there's a bit of a stereotype of property managers in the industry. Usually they're cranky. We are cranky. Like to sit in the office, don't answer phone calls, and yeah, that we just collect rent. When you deal with maintenance, when you deal with compliance, when you deal with all of that sort of stuff, which really is a cut above the sort of standard, you're balancing all of those things, and you are the very last protection for the client, right? So you think about all the things that could go wrong, and then you've got someone there who's actually looking after it for you, and that's really that's not dissimilar to, for example, what you guys do, right? So you are just a professional who exists in that space to make sure that everything is okay.
What criteria should first-time investors consider when selecting their first property?
Oh, that's great. I think one of the things that a lot of first-time investors kind of get a little bit wrapped up in is that they might want to look at just getting investor stock. What they've got to remember is that they're going to have that property, hopefully, for quite a long time. I think it's about 13 years is the average investment hold in New South Wales, right? So for that period of time, that property is going to appreciate. And if you get standard, stock standard, boring stuff, it's not going to appreciate in the same way that something a little bit special will. And you minimize or you reduce your market at the very end. Do you know what I mean? So if you buy investor stock, who are you going to sell to? An investor. Whereas you actually want from a sales point of view, you want to be looking at the emotional buy, the person who comes in and says, yep, I want to buy this. What's the price? Tell me the price. I'm moving in tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? Like that sort of thing.
I think as well, like a piece of advice we give our clients is like when we're buying investment properties for them, we say, could you see yourself living here? And if they're like, well, no, like we go, well, then it's not right property for you because at the end of the day, we're here to help you build growth and, you know, get that return at the end.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Absolutely. And beyond that as well, as a contingency, especially if you're buying locally, if you're buying in your same city that you live in, if something goes wrong, something happens, you actually can move into that unit.
And you want to purchase something that has a bit of character, that is attractive, that will just people will rent at a premium price.
100%. There's a reason why we call it, if you were to liken it to something else, you'd be looking at, for example, IKEA versus Natuzzi. Do you know what I mean? If you go and buy IKEA, there's millions of them. Yeah, exactly. There's millions of them. They're all the same. Of course, it costs $14.99. But if you go and buy Natuzzi and you end up selling that later, you're going to get a Natuzzi buyer
100%.
Yeah.
and a Natuzzi tenant.
You know, it's not always about yield, right? Because you don't know how long you're going to hold that investment. I mean, the average might be 13 years, but in your mind, you might be thinking this is a 3 to 5 year plan and you want to get a return on that investment at the end. And it's not just, you know, a yield. Well, we don't look at it certainly just based on yield.
Well, your portfolio needs to have everything involved, right? So maybe some properties that are yield based, some properties that are not. You know, you've covered yourselves in all bases. That's a good strategy.
Then where do you think some investors could go wrong and what can they do to avoid it?
Assuming that what they're getting into, what they're experiencing is actually what is the norm. Ask questions or have someone along the ride who will ask the questions for you.
Plug Okio.
Exactly, right? Making sure that when you go into this, that you aren't just, I think that this is what we're supposed to be doing. Do you know what I mean? Be curious. Ask the agent. Ask the whoever's involved. Avoid asking someone at a barbecue, please. Barbecue advice is never good, but
Like bathroom advice.
100%, 100%. But really, yeah, dig in. And at the end of this thing, no one's going to care about who you were or if you annoyed someone with your questions. You know what I mean? Put that aside. Get over that. This is your life. This is your investment. This is your potential future. So grab it by the teeth and shake.
And that's why you are an expert as well, and you seek advice from an expert, and that's what they're there for, to answer your questions. So don't be afraid to ask it because it can cost you a lot more in the long run.
Yeah. Okay, so you've touched on this question already, but what advice do you have for someone that's never bought an investment property before and they're starting on that journey? What would you say is the best piece of advice you can give them?
Build your team. Build your team and that team's probably going to be with you for a while. Do you know what I mean? So be very selective, do your research. And I think that one of the nicer things about what we're seeing, especially in the modern property space, is that it's leaning away from the DIY model. It's leaning towards people having support and doing things the right way, because I think originally it was kind of a bit like, oh, you know what, everyone can just try it themselves. And if someone loses, who cares? But we actually have a little bit more understanding that when someone loses, they really lose. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I would say build your team, work out who it's going to be, and start that process of future-proofing yourself.
Can you share a success story or example of how effective property management positively impacted a first-time investor's experience or just any investor's experience?
Very pleased to say that I've never lost a tribunal case. But most of the time that's been because tribunal is all about preparation and keeping a very level head. Members, they are not interested in your emotional stuff. They just, especially if you're an agent, they just want to hear the facts. They want to know what's going on and so on and so forth. So one of my favorite stories, which I call the magic carpet story, was where a tenant tried to get out of not paying for new carpet throughout the property, and there were multicolored stains in the apartment, like everywhere. And we went to tribunal, tried to get the cost back for the carpet. What was working in our favor was that the original carpet was much more expensive, but had been discontinued. So we were trying to go like for like, but the new version was like 1/3 the price. Like it was much cheaper. So the tribunal member was already pretty happy about awarding that. But he had a signed statement from a friend of his who was a carpet importer. And I don't know if you know this, when you go to tribunal, you have the opportunity, past the mediation stage and you go to a formal hearing, you have to submit evidence, and then they have a response, and then you have an opportunity to respond again, and then you go to tribunal, and then they look at all the evidence, right? So we received the pack of evidence from this guy, and this friend of his, you know, Mr. Magoo from wherever, who knows who this guy is. He's a carpet importer, and he has written this letter about how terrible this carpet is, and the original carpet. And he'd never put it in a tenancy, and it's really, really low quality. So what did I do? I went on his website and asked for a quote. And I get all of the marketing material. This is the best carpet you can possibly put in. It's 6-star rating. You must, blah, blah. I got that all in writing and presented it as a...
Oh my
Oh my God.
I've seen pettiness in tribunals before as well. I had a member of tribunal. She calculated, so what was going on? It was in Bondi Junction, and the tenant wanted a 50% reduction on his rent because from the hours of 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. at night, if his light was dimmed on a dimmer switch, it would flicker, and that caused him issues. And so he wanted 50% reduction in his rent. But the tribunal member calculated the exact amount of rent he was paying based on those lights in the living room for the property for those hours. And so it was like $1.75 or something, and that was her order. That we had to pay that back. You can literally get that. It was something like that. It was really small amount, based on the electricity cost and so on and so forth. And so reading those reading that.
Imagine, reading the report on
The report
that.
from the tribunal member where she's calculated the whole thing was just brilliant. And then the owner instructed us to pay that in 5-cent pieces.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, jeez, talk about petty. I love it.
Right.
We didn't. For the record, we didn't.
So do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners? Anyone looking to start on their property journey in terms of buying an investment?
You've arrived here, right? You're listening to something, you're educating yourself, you're starting on the journey. That's the best place to be, right? Enjoy this moment because it is actually a lot of fun as you're learning. Don't be too stressed about the whole thing. I mean, the best time to buy something is yesterday, but you're still on the journey. It's your journey, and be proud of that journey as well. That's really important. Build your team, and if you choose the right people, they'll actually be with you for years. And it will not be just one. It'll be 2, 3, 4, what have you, okay? Because all of these pieces that you're putting together will set you up in the long term.
Amazing.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you.
for being
Honestly,
here.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So grateful that you've taken time to meet with us. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
And if there's any, first-time investors or, anyone looking for a property manager, we'll
We
link
know-
your
we know
business
who to
down
send.
the description.
Like, comment, subscribe.